Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nur Amina Jiha binti Saiful Azrimi. I'm from DBS 5E. Now I want to present about consideration and intention to create legal relation. First is consideration. Definition of consideration is in section 2 clause D provide that when the desire of the promisor or any other person has done or abstain from doing or does or abstain from doing or promises to do or to abstain from doing something, such act or abstinence or promise is called a consideration or the promise. For case example, Courier v. Misa, Lush J state that a valuable consideration in the scene of the law may consist in some right, interest, profit, or benefit acquiring to the one party or some forbearance, detriment, loss, or responsibility given, suffered, or undertaken by the other. There have three categories of consideration. First, executory consideration. Second, executed consideration. And lastly, past consideration. Here we go for second category consideration. It was executory consideration. It is when one promise is made in return for another promise, Section 2 Clause D, at the desire of the promiser, the promise or any other person promises to do or to abstain from doing something. For case example, we can look at K. Muruga Gesu v. Nadaraja. The applicant agreed to sell and the respondent agreed to buy a house from the applicant. The agreement and therefore the contract is void. It was held that the agreement must be seen to be case of executory consideration. A promise is made by one party in return for a promise made by other. In such a case, each promise is the consideration for the other. Second category is executed consideration. A consideration is executed when a promise is made in return to the performance of an act. In Section 2 Clause D, provide that when at the desire of the promisor, the promise or any other person does or abstains from doing something. For example, X promises to pay 200 ringgit to anyone who finds and returns his lost handphone. In response to the offer, Y put some effort and finally find the handphone of X. Y return it to X. In this situation, the act of Y in finding and returning the handphone is the executed consideration for X promise to pay. Therefore, X promise is contract. Last category is past consideration. One promise made subsequent to and in return for an act that has already been performed. The promise is made on account of a past consideration. For case example, we can look at Lamplick v. Braithwaite. B was sentenced to death for murder. B requested L to do all he can to get a pardon for him from the king in London. L exerted himself running up and down between London and Newmarket at his own expenses and finally got a pardon for B. B promised L £100 for that but subsequently failed to pay. L sued B. B argued that there was no consideration from L when B could be bound by such a contract. I want to present about intention to create legal relation. They have two. First is commercial or business agreement. Second, social, domestic or family agreement. First, commercial or business agreement. The law presumes that intention exists between the party to have legal relation once the parties entered into commercial agreements such as a sale and purchase agreement. The law presumes that the party have intention to create legal relation. The contract is therefore binding on the parties unless the parties specify otherwise. For case example, we can look at Win v. Bull. An agreement was made between the plaintiff and the defendant for a lease of a house subject to the preparation and approval of a formal contract. Since, in this case, no further formal contract was entered into, the court held that there was no enforceable contract. Second, social, domestic and family agreement. Agreement which are made between friend and family member on certain family or social arrangement. In such an agreement, the law presumes that there is no create legal relation between the parties. The contract is not binding on the parties as it is presumed by law that it is not intended to have legal consequences in the event any parties fail to fulfill his or her obligation. For last case example, we can look at Balfour v. Balfour. Defendant was a civil servant stationed in Sri Lanka. He has promised to pay his wife a monthly allowance as maintenance. His wife had to stay in England and unable to follow the defendant to Sri Lanka because for her health. Later, the defendant failed to keep the promise and the wife sued the defendant for breach of contract. It was held that the defendant's promise was not a legally binding and unenforceable contract because the agreement was a family and domestic agreement with no intention to create legal relation. Thank you.